All right, peeps, good morning, everyone, on this cold, snowy morning. Last class before Thanksgiving break, and kind of a perfect time to start in on the immune system. Let me just make sure that I'm sharing my screen to record it properly. Oh, yep, that looks like it's working. Yeah, we're going to dive into the immune system today. We might cover it. We might not get through all of it today. What we don't cover, we'll just pick up the Monday after break. The immune system is super, super complicated. We could spend, you get a whole degree in the immune system and there'd still be a lot of unknowns. We're going to do a whirlwind tour and just talk about some of the major anatomical structures at the organ level, and also talk a little bit about a couple different types of immune cells and how they work at the cellular level. I want to start off by reviewing your ticket out for Wednesday. There's just one question I want to make sure we've got a good understanding of. We'll start in on the immune system. Got your Friday Venn diagram, and then we are going to end class today. The last 20 minutes will be quiz number 5. I'm doing it at the end of class. This way, once you finish, you feel good, you can hand it in, you can go. I wanted to just give us a little flexibility that way. I normally do it at the beginning of class because I like to kind of get it out of the way, but I thought I'd try something different today. Bear with me if it's not working for you. If you'd rather just take it in the beginning next time, that's fine. I'll solicit some feedback from you and see what works and what people prefer. That's the scoop. Before we dive in, what questions do you have? Yes, Marge.
What questions are on the quiz?
What questions are on the quiz? Well, I heavily suggested that you look over the study guide. So you all on Monday's class, everyone had a different section of the brain, and you prepared some questions and diagrams about that. Yeah. And then I put all that together in a study guide.
I looked at the study guide, so it's like mostly study guide.
You should make sure in your studying efforts that you focus on the study guide. Okay. Cool. Good question, Marge. Any other questions? All right, let's do it. So Wednesday, on your way out, I asked you this question. I said lymphatic capillaries ... And about half of you got the right answer here, which is that have endothelial cells that are separated by flap-like mini valves that open wide. And that's the correct answer here. And I want to just walk through, I want to show you that one and then show you why the other answers are not correct. So I'm going to go back to this diagram I showed you on Wednesday. This is the end, like or I guess I should say actually the beginning of a lymphatic capillary. Remember that these capillaries are one way, so they absorb liquids and other molecules at one end, and they transport them, eventually dumping them into the where does all this lymph eventually end up? Blood. Yeah, dumps it back into your bloodstream eventually, right? But it all starts here at the lymphatic capillary, and they have these mini valves that are these little kind of flaps, so that basically liquid can go in if pressure is greater on the outside than the inside. But once they fill up, the pressure on the inside would push out and close that valve, so it makes it a one-way flow. So they can essentially suck up liquids and other molecules without then releasing those back into the connective tissue. Now, the other answers I have here include they have continuous tight junctions like those of the capillaries of the blood-brain barrier. In fact, the opposite, the blood-brain barrier is meant to be very, very selectively permeable and only allow certain molecules through, whereas these lymphatic capillaries are the opposite. They're trying to mop up basically everything, including large molecules. Other answer here are open-ended like drinking straws. You can see that they're definitely not just open-ended. They have these specific structure with these flaps. Other answer here was they have special barriers that stop cancerous cells from entering. Remember that it's the opposite. Again, we want those cancerous cells to get sucked up by the lymph so they can land in the lymph nodes, and then they'll be attacked by immune cells, and we'll cover that today. So I want to make sure everyone got this. I asked you 2 other questions. One of them 100% of the class got correct, and the other one something like 95% of the class got correct. So I'm not going to review those because it seems like you've got a good understanding of that. I just wanted to go over this and make sure that checked out. Don't be fooled by the all of the above, by the way. I suspect that since I never really put all of the above on a question, when you see it sometimes you're like, oh, that must be it. So just be aware of that on quizzes and exams and things. Cool? Questions? All right, flap-like mini valve, there it is. Let's talk about the immune system. So the immune system's job is to recognize specific foreign molecules and basically destroy them. And we're going to talk about a couple different ways that the immune system operates. Your immune system initiates what's called an inflammatory response, whereby blood and associated molecules and immune cells go to the site of a location. Because you're bringing extra fluid and extra cells and extra stuff there, that area gets inflamed, often can be very sensitive to the touch. Anyone that's ever had any kind of like little infection or a big infection knows that it's really touchy. Everything from, getting a little infected pimple or something like that can be super painful. There's two different primary kinds of immune cells we talk about. One is called a macrophage and the other is called a lymphocyte. Macrophages are more generalist, whereas lymphocytes are developed in such a way that they target specific types of invaders. So let's look at this on an anatomical scale first. Lymphocytes, these second kind of immune cells that target specific kinds of invaders, are found in both lymphoid tissues and lymphoid organs. And you can see in yellow here the distribution of some of the lymphoid organs around the body. And those include the following: your lymph nodes. We talked about your lymph nodes. We talked about your lymph nodes in class on Monday. The lymph nodes actually aren't on this diagram, but we know them from the previous lecture where they are. Just as a reminder, we have superficial kind of clusters of lymph nodes in 3 regions of the body. Who can name one of those regions? Clusters of lymph nodes superficially. Yes, Gia. Axillary, yep, based around your armpits. Good. Number 2. Cervical, yep, in your neck region. That's what your doctor feels when you often go to see if you have an infection there. Gia, let me get someone else to do number 3. Thank you, though. So we've got cervical, axillary, and Julia. Yeah. Yeah, inguinal. Yep. So that's the region where your limb meets your torso, right? So we have those are where your clusters of these lymph nodes. We also, lymphoid organs include your tonsils. You've all probably heard about your tonsils, probably at some point in your life had a tonsil infection of some sort. This really cool organ called the thymus, we'll talk about in more detail. Your spleen, which you will, this is one of the structures that you'll see really prominently on your cat when we do our digestive system lab. You have these nodules associated with your intestines, and then your appendix, interestingly, is considered a lymphoid organ as well, and plays an important immune function role. So sometimes people call the appendix like this vestigial organ that doesn't really have a function in humans anymore, but is just left over from our evolutionary precursors. Well, that's not really the case. The appendix actually does play a role. You can live without it, but it does do some stuff, and we'll talk about that. So these are the general structures. What I'm going to do today is just kind of walk through each of these in order, again, giving you a very superficial overview of what goes on at each of those organs. Cool. What I want to emphasize here is that these organs are sites where lymphocytes tend to congregate and basically do their thing. So before I get into the structures of these, I want to talk about lymphocytes and where they come from. The short answer is that all lymphocytes originate in the red bone marrow of your long bones. So this is important to note that all lymphocytes start off in the red bone marrow. And remember, that's primarily in the diaphyses, the pleural diaphysis in your long bones. That changes over time as you mature. You have less red bone marrow in some of those long bones, and the very long bones, for lack of a better term. But you still have red bone marrow. You just kind of have less of it. Basically, your immune system just gets crappier as you get older. Now, all of those lymphocytes originate there. Some of them then circulate through the bloodstream and travel to the thymus, where they become T lymphocytes. T standing for thymus. So remember, easy association, T lymphocytes go to are originated in bone marrow and then travel to the thymus where they mature. Others stay in the bone marrow and they differentiate into something called B lymphocytes. Now, it seems obvious that B would be for bone. Weirdly, the B doesn't stand for bone, but don't worry about it in your mind. It's much easier to remember. T lymphocytes are in the thymus, B lymphocytes in the red bone marrow. So they all start in the bone marrow. Some go to the thymus, some stay in the bone marrow. Ones go to the thymus are T lymphocytes. The ones staying in the bone marrow are B lymphocytes. And therefore, we consider the thymus and the red bone marrow your primary lymphoid organs. This is the place where these lymphocytes mature. I'm going to talk about what I mean by mature in just a second. So remember, if I ask you the question, where do all lymphocytes originate? The answer is red bone marrow. Some of them then stay there to mature. Some of them move to the thymus to mature, but they all start off in the bone. Cool. I'm going to talk very broadly about a couple different lymphocytes. The first is what's called a cytotoxic T lymphocyte. So these are lymphocytes that mature in the thymus, as you know, because they're T lymphocytes. And what they do is they attack foreign cells directly because they can recognize these specific markers on the outside of the cells called antigens, right? And what they do is they basically kind of engulf the cell. They release some chemicals that perforate the membrane, and they basically convince the cell to destroy itself. And so this works, these cells operate to destroy basically your own cells that have gone awry. And so they'll destroy virus-infected cells. So if you have one of your own cells that's infected with a virus, or a cancer cell. It's noteworthy here that in both of these cases, the lymphocytes are actually attacking your human cells, just either that are infected or that have gone cancerous. B lymphocytes, on the other hand, they mature and become something called plasma cells. And what these guys do is they don't destroy the cells themselves, but they find cells that need to be destroyed, and they send out antibodies that attach to those cells. And these antibodies are basically like markers that tell your macrophages to go and take care of those cells and get rid of them. By take care of them, I mean that like in the euphemistic sense, destroy them. In these guys, your B lymphocytes are primarily responding to bacterial cells or toxins associated with bacteria. I'm going to show you this in a diagram form first, or next here, but just as a to review, the T cells are directly attacking your own cells that have become infected or cancerous. B cells are becoming plasma cells and then marking bacterial cells primarily for destruction. There's a nice diagram in your book that I'll show you here, but let me get Morgan's question first. Good question. When you donate plasma, you actually, so this is a good example where I wish these plasma cells weren't called that, because in this sense, plasma means something different, basically. These cells are found in the plasma of your blood, but when you donate plasma, basically you're donating everything in your blood except for your cells. So it's all of the liquid proteins, everything that's in your blood, minus your red blood cells and your white blood cells. Those are filtered out. When you donate whole blood, you're just donating everything, including those red blood cells. That's a great question. All right, let's look at this in a diagram. I want to show you what a T lymphocyte does. So this is, again, those immune cells that mature in the thymus. What they do is they identify cells that are bearing these specific antigens that mark them as being something that needs to be destroyed. And they basically go to the cell, they release these molecules that destroy the cell membrane, and they induce apoptosis or programmed cell death. They basically hijack the cell in a way that forces it to destroy itself. So takeaway message, T cells are maturing in the thymus. They're then directly attacking these cells that are bearing these specific antigens. B cells, on the other hand, is a little more complicated. They mature into plasma cells that release these antibodies, right? And these antibodies are these little markers that stick to bacteria, and they basically label the bacteria for destruction, and then a macrophage will come around, and the macrophage will target cells that present these antibodies, and they will then gobble them up. And macrophages generally work by phagocytizing these bacteria. So they completely engulf them and then digest them, which is different from how these T lymphocytes destroy those infected or cancerous cells. And that is all the level we are going to get to. There's way more complicated stuff going on here in terms of the different types of antibodies and how they're marked and different types of bacteria and viruses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is kind of the general gross overview of how these T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes work. I'm going to pause here and see what questions you have. Okay. So I'm going to go back to this bigger diagram here, thinking about these immune cells. Remember, our primary lymphoid organs are your red bone marrow and your thymus. So all of these lymphocytes originate in the red bone marrow. Some stay in the red bone marrow. Some move to the thymus. They then kind of circulate through the body and do their job in different places. And you'll note here, I've got a little picture of some capillaries. So they're traveling through the bloodstream. And they tend to accumulate in these lymph nodes. So they'll travel through the bloodstream. They might get released into connective tissue, and then they get mopped up by the lymphatic capillaries and are delivered to these lymph nodes and tend to accumulate there. Because not only these immune cells, but also infected or cancerous cells tend to accumulate there as well. So it's kind of like a spot where your body can concentrate that battle against potential infections. Oh, and I just walked through all of this. Let me see if there's anything I missed. I forgot that I had text on here. Both B and Liam. Yep, I said that. That works. They circulate around. They go to the different lymphoid organs. Great. Oh, I didn't mention this. So the lymphocytes are activated when their receptors bind to an antigen. So this is what we call activation of the lymphocyte. This is when they start to essentially become active, and they have to bind to a specific antigen. So something has to trigger them. This is how vaccines work in your long-term immunity, because you have these lymphocytes that are circulating and they're basically ready to go. And as soon as they encounter that antigen representing a specific kind of pathogen, they're like, all right, boom, let's go, right? And a vaccine basically helps your body develop these long-term lymphocytes in advance, so that when they are presented with the antigen, let's say from the flu virus or something like that, they're like, all right, let's do this. And they're all there ready to go. And you can immediately kind of quash that potential infection before it manifests. Let's see here. And then, once those lymphocytes are activated, then they divide, they proliferate, and they differentiate into different kinds of cells that do different stuff throughout the body. And we're just not going to get into that level of detail. But what's important here is that you have these lymphocytes, and when they're ready to go, then it allows for this response to happen that much quicker and allow you to ward off infection that much faster. Whereas if you don't have those lymphocytes ready to go, it takes longer to activate that whole system. In that time where it's being activated, those viruses or those bacterial cells are multiplying, and that's when you get sick and get an infection. Eventually, hopefully, this system will kick in and fight off that infection. But in the meantime, you might have been miserable for several days, and you're also going to shed virus to a whole bunch of other people. So when you're vaccinated, it's not that the virus or bacteria doesn't get into you, and it's not that you're just like block it off entirely. What happens is it gets in, your body immediately responds and knocks it out before it can spread and proliferate. That is the world's fastest tour of the immune system. Let's talk a little bit about some of these lymphoid tissues found throughout the body. Mostly we find the what's called lymphoid tissue in two places. One is called MALT, or mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So it is exactly what we say from the name here. So it's associated with the mucus linings of your digestive, urinary, respiratory, and reproductive tracts. So all these places where you have these mucus membranes, you have this tissue that's associated with the mucus membranes, and that's a site of an accumulation of these lymph cells. What makes sense is you think about where all these places you have these mucus membrane are places where your body might get pathogens coming into, because it's places where you're exposed to things coming from the outside world. Your digestive system through food you consume, your urinary tract, possibly through infectious agents in your blood, your respiratory system, because you're constantly inhaling air and all the little molecules that are in it, your reproductive tract, etc. These lymphoid tissue also is in all of these organs that I mentioned earlier, with the exception of the thymus. And I'll talk about the thymus in a little more detail in a second. But we have these lymphoid tissues in the tonsils, right? Another place where you're bringing in a lot of pathogens into your body constantly. Your spleen, where some of these cells kind of accumulate and are processed, and then associated with the digestive system here on these lymphoid nodules and your appendix. Go ahead, Abby, and then Jada.
Like tonsils are supposed to help you fight infection. When people get them removed, like how does that help you get less sick?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, it's funny that you say that, because I was thinking about that as I was putting this lecture together. Removing your tonsils doesn't help you fight infection. Basically, what happens, if my understanding is correct, is after repeated infections, your tonsils just they're not effective anymore, and they're just constantly getting infected. And so removing them just prevents them from getting infected because they're not there anymore. Now, what I think will happen, and I'll show you some tonsil slides in a second, is that your other tonsils will kind of have to step up their game, because those are sites where you're fighting infection. And so if you're removing them, you need other places to fight that infection. But exactly what happens that makes some of them basically not good to have and beneficial to remove them, I'm not sure exactly. But let me get back to that, because I was actually thinking that same thing myself. That's a good question.
I actually had a question about tonsils too.
Yeah.
I was more concerned about tonsil stones, like is that like just like part in like infections of the?
Yeah. You can get like accumulation of like minerals and things like that, and then they can need to be removed or something. I'm not sure exactly, again, the process there and why that happens. I mean, it happens at the tonsils because that's the site of where the bacteria and immune cells are, but why it leads to that kind of thing, I don't know. And you can get like accumulation of like pus and stuff like that in there too. And that's why, that's why you say, when you go to the doctor, they're looking at those tonsils to see if they're inflamed, if there's, you can literally see like big gobs of goop from infections and things like that. It's good times. Yeah, go ahead, Sam. You did. Oh yeah. Tell us about that.
It's a collection of bacteria in like they call like the tonsil caves. So there's these
Mhm.
little grooves inside your tonsils, and like sometimes when you eat or digest bacteria gets caught in the like in the back of your throat. It happens if you eat a lot of bread, first of all.
Really?
Because they said like the bread will like kind of decompose because it has yeast in it, and so it like makes that bacteria. But it also just like is a hereditary thing. You can get them more often. It's like more grooves in your tonsils.
Right. Oh, cool. And you?
Are they beef? No, they're just like annoying. Like sometimes I like feel them when I was younger, but like I don't get them anymore.
How do they get them out when they do that? They just kind of pop them out?
I just literally just take a toothbrush and just spray it.
On the front, you like down inside and then it gets it out. Oh,
They
cool.
either do that or like they take water and just whoop.
Just rinse it out, kind of. Huh, interesting. There you go. Cool. Thanks, Zoe. Yeah. Next time you get that, save one for us, okay?
Ew.
All right. So we've got these lymphoid organs found throughout the body here. I want to walk through all of these, and I'm going to actually start with the thymus. Let me just do a time check here. I'm actually going to pause there. I'll start off in the thymus. That's actually a good transition point to dive in for on Monday's lecture. Any questions about what we've covered today before we transition here? All right, so I'm going to skip ahead. I do have a final slide for you here. I did promise you your Friday Venn diagram. Note that you do not have a class program over break. So I tried to structure class so that as long as you're caught up on your work and everything, you should have little to nothing to do over break. which I think is what break should be. So please take that time to not do work or just get caught up if you're behind on some things. We'll pick things up. We have 2 weeks of class left after break. We've got 2 more labs to do, and we've got quite a bit of material to work through. And I'll give you details of that after break. But I wanted to kind of intentionally set things up so that you're in a good spot. You can actually take a break. Here's your Friday Venn diagram. This one's kind of nice. And then we are going to transition and take quiz number 5. So after you've enjoyed the Venn diagram, go ahead and clear your spot and I will pass out the quiz for you. All right, those of you viewing at home, I'm going to pause this here. Whoops.